That was for you, Sean. Oh, dang, I forgot to start the other thing. This is pretty professional, everybody. Welcome to the Libram Society. I am co-host Jason, and with me today, I have my co-host.
Hi, I'm Arlen Walker, and I'm the other co-host for the Libram Society. And we'll be joined by another host, another person today, a very special guest. Forrest, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Forrest Aguirre. You may remember me from such podcasts as Glowburn. Yeah.
He is also an awarded, well-known author with, I think, the book I like the best, maybe the only book I read, to be honest. No, I've read two, maybe. HeroClix and Pomp, right?
HeroClix and Pomp, yep.
Yeah, pretty good book, Arlen. You should check that out if you get the opportunity. So anyway, today, you guys, we are going to be talking about some long-dead author and one of his short stories. This is one of our, hey, here we go. Oh, I got us switched. We're facing the wrong direction, Arlen. Who's in charge of this? Who's in charge of this stuff?
I know. We got to fire our AV guy.
Yeah, if all I was doing was the AV, I'd probably be better. So
again?
Yeah, it's just going to be a new one. Just go ahead.
Okay.
We'll have to edit it out of the podcast, but hopefully people will be able to stick with it. The YouTube may not be going, but that's okay too. Go ahead.
I got a comment. YouTube locked up. Anyway, William Morris was a designer of a number of different things. I believe he paid for all the stuff that he did by largely through textile design.
Correct.
And designing things like wallpaper for Victorians. And
he was big in the arts and crafts movement.
Yeah,
huge. In fact, he was like the father of the arts and crafts movement. Actually, that kind of dovetailed with Art Nouveau around that same time.
Yeah, and you can still find, if you search William Morris on Amazon, you'll find, in addition to his books, you'll find stuff with William Morris prints because people still appreciate his particular designs. When I first learned about William Morris in a college class, he was associated with pre-Raphaelite art.
Yep.
And that was sort of what we talked about with regard to William Morris. So if you know anything about basically pre-Raphaelite is people who, especially British artists who, in relation to painting, believed that Raphael, I can't remember where he's from, and now I feel really silly. But, the famous Renaissance painter had sent painting in one particular direction, and that wasn't necessarily the way it had to develop. One direction with regard to especially things like perspective and anatomical detail and all this other sort of stuff, and that painting from the pre-Raphaelite period, like medieval painting, could have developed in a different direction, and these Victorians were interested in exploring that different direction. And William Morris's fiction in some ways does something similar, that it's in some ways an exploration of medieval or modernist medieval literature from the perspective of what it could have been rather than what it actually developed into.
There are other authors, Dante, Gabriel, Rosetti, who comes to mind, who wrote in a very similar vein. Their whole take on art was looking back at mostly at Fra Angelico is where they looked to the most. We had like William Holman Hunt and Dante Gabriel Rossetti and several others, Swinburne, Ford Madox Brown. There were a ton of painters who were the pre-Raphaelites. And if you're into fantasy artwork at all, I guarantee you that it was influenced by the pre-Raphaelites. Absolutely 100% it was influenced by the pre-Raphaelites.
That's pretty interesting. I thought that I had read once that he was like one of the first artists to actually use textiles or some kind of textile art or something. Did you guys already say that, or did I miss it? Or you guys know?
We talked a little bit about textiles. That was sort of how he paid for everything.
Yeah,
Textile design.
So he would design rooms also. Like he would go and basically design this entire room, carve the wood in a design that was like his paintings. It's very florid, just like his writing. It's kind of funny because you can kind of see his design in the writing too, I think.
Nice. That is cool. So it says here that he was born in 1834 and died in 1896. The actual story that we're going to do was published in the Oxford and Cambridge magazine in 1856. He also has some novels published: The Glittering Plain in 1891, The Wood Beyond the World in 1895, and The Well at the World's End in 1896. So this was a couple days ago that this guy was popular. So yeah, I think that does it. I mean, I think that's about as much as anybody in the world still alive today knows about William Morris. No? All right, so lots of times, Forrest, I shouldn't say lots of times, this is episode flipping 2 after all. But one of our ideas was if they have like a reading at the beginning of a chapter, we're going to actually do the reading and somebody will read it. As the guest, I think we usually do the Malazan stuff, so I think you could read this reading at the beginning if you want. Okay,
now I'm looking at the Project Gutenberg.
So maybe it's not on there.
It's not going to be on there, yeah.
All right, so Arlen, you want to go or you want me to?
I'm happy to do it.
All right, go for it, bro.
All right. We find in ancient story many wonders told of heroes in great glory, with spirit free and bold, of joyances and high tides, of weeping and of woe, of noble reckon striving, mote ye now wonders know. That's from a translation of the Nibelungenlied. It says, see Carlyle's Miscellanies. So I assume that's Thomas Carlyle that's referring to, because I think he translated the Nibelungenlied, or at least chunks of it.
It's Lied. Just
Lied? Oh.
Yes. I was born in Germany. I can't help but correct it. Sorry.
Okay. Yes.
I was glad he did it because I wouldn't have been able to say the Nibelungen like that. So nice. Good work, Arlen. So from not being able to read it, Forrest, what do you make of that reading as it pertains to the Hollowland?
Actually, it is on my copy here. So, I mean, it kind of sets the tone really more than anything about the ancient stories and wonders. And I mean, it's got all these elements, right? Really, yeah. It's a romantic story. I mean, the Nibelungenlied was a romantic opera. And so it's just echoing Richard Wagner's voice basically in that.
Nice. Arlen, you got anything to add to that?
No, I agree. I suspect this is from the early chunk of the poem, the Nibelungenlied itself, because it was a High German medieval epic. In addition to being the Saga of the Volsungs, which is Old Norse, I believe. Anyway, so I suspect that this is kind of a clever use of an introduction for another work to introduce this work in some ways.
And not uncommon at that time.
Oh, really?
People did that all the time. Yeah, and there was often something in Latin. They'd be quoting some Herodotus or somebody in Latin.
So do you think that Morris himself put this, or was this added by like some editor on the magazine or something? No idea.
Don't know.
Interesting.
As a writer, I'd put it in myself, but I don't know. It could have been an editorial interpolation. I'm not sure.
I think we're going to give it to. I think we'll give it to Morris in this instance. Why not? He can't say yay or nay.
Score 1 for Morris.
All right. So, were we gonna give a brief synopsis first? Do you think, or do you want to just kind of dive right into it? I think maybe a brief how we feel about it a little bit, or wait for that, or what? What do you think, Arlen?
Let's do a very brief synopsis, just because it's kind of a strange story, so it probably helps to make sure that we're all on the same page about what actually happens.
All right. That's a cool idea, because I'm not sure all of us will think we're on the same story. Because in my mind, from what I read out of this, I'm like, sweet, this is like a cool tale about a knight whose brother, started as a knight for some chick. She didn't like it, slapped him across the face, and scandalously embarrassed him in front of everyone. And so years later, he got his brother to help him kill her. And then when they were wandering around, her son found him in some weird ass place. They got in a fight. They lost. And then I don't know what the hell happens after that for the next half of the book. That's my synopsis. Shit gets weird after that.
It definitely gets weird after chapter 3. So the first 2 chapters are, in a lot of ways, kind of the fairly standard, what we would call today fantasy or historical fiction, really, right? They're sort of just what has happened in this particular world, and it's unclear. We're in some sort of medieval Western Europe, clearly, but we're not ever told that we're like specifically in England or specifically in France or anything like that. The same way that the chivalric romances themselves wouldn't say, it doesn't say, and then Yvain went to Scotland. It just talks about Yvain in the forest and the mountains and all that. But the chapter 3, which is divided into 3 parts, and I think there's a lot to the third chapter that's symbolic, and part of it is, it's hard to not notice that this, while it is a sort of fantasy world, it is also a deeply Christian one. And the third chapter is divided into 3 parts, and a lot of these different scenes seem to have particular or it would be easy to interpret them in terms of Christian symbolism. And we can get into that in a minute. But the third chapter is, I think, really where you could certainly describe it in terms of non-real experience, right? You could say that Florian just got hit on the head and he's having this sort of vision of things, if you wanted to interpret it that way, I think, or if you wanted to read it that way. I don't think that really does it justice, but it is definitely the strangest part of the story is this last third, which is only like 10 pages long or something.
Yeah, if you take it as a purely psychological text, yeah, you could say he got knocked on the head or, had these crazy visions, or you could take a more mystical approach, which I think is my tack on it, a more weird with a capital W, if you will, that it does become a weird story where I think of Mark Fisher's book, The Weird and the Eerie, and I'm forgetting it. Anyway, one way of being weird is by taking things out of something that would normally belong there, that's missing. Other way would be to throw things in there that would not normally be there. And I think this is the case here, where you've got an entire world really that should not be there. And you could also argue, was he dead? And was he in dead? Some kind? Yeah. Or is he in some kind of purgatory? That's another interpretation. Or did he have kind of a mystical, supernatural experience? Before the show, we were talking about Arthur Machen. He wrote about that kind of experience all the time, and I really caught echoes from Machen's later work of what was going on here. There was kind of a mystical undertone to the whole thing, kind of a spiritual side.
Well, I think those are all great insights. Let's restart at the beginning, but first, let's go to the audience. It looks like on YouTube, Crumb wants to say that William Morris knowledge hit me hard there. Tremendous insights. Hoping I can pass my in-checks to keep up. I certainly did not, Crumb. So good luck to you, sir. You want to read the next one, Arlen?
Yeah. So Jonathan Davis says, wait, why is that Aguirre guy on here? Is this a post-apocalyptic show? And then a tongue out smiley face. So.
Chronologically, yes, it is a post-apocalyptic show.
Yeah,
but we're all living in that.
Yeah.
It feels kind of like a post-apocalyptic because this dude did some serious drugs on this dang story because I don't know what the hell's going on. All right,
it's funny. It's funny. Well, it's funny you say that though, Jason, because honestly, opium was big then. It was a big. No, I'm serious. I mean, dead
I
serious.
believe you. But I mean, did they have a lot of? Did they have a lot of opium in, the United Kingdom though at that point?
Oh yeah,
you think so?
100%. I guarantee you because, well, I'm not going to confess things. I was a teenager.
I guarantee you.
I was a teenager living in England. Let's just put it that way.
Oh,
yes,
well, no,
definitely.
This is the 1890 that this guy
Even
wrote
then,
this.
you had they colonized India 100 years earlier.
Yeah.
Well, and you also have characters. So like Thomas de Quincey basically started taking opium because Coleridge took opium and lived his entire life in an opium haze from like the 1820s on until he died, and just sort of rose out of it to write beautiful things every once in a while. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a sort of there's definitely a strong tradition of drugs alongside this romantic literature. So
Hobbs, have you heard of Xanadu? You've heard the phrase Xanadu or the name Xanadu? So that was a poem that began in Xanadu did Kubla Khan, a stately ruler, yada 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 yada, by Coleridge, and it was basically his translation into verse of an opium dream.
Yeah,
and very English, very much English with the colonialism and with the hashish and opium. Yeah, big deal right then.
Yeah, it may very well be. It is a strange story. Maybe. Well, why don't we dive into it? I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about my dang.
Yeah,
I went. Again.
I got to change my settings.
Hey, there's two of me, and I'm like a mirror on here. Look at this.
Okay, there he is.
We're waiting for him. We'll mention Fred Daniels in the chat on YouTube, and he asked if it was a smoke dream. I don't know. But Jonathan Davis, I should say that it is Forrest Aguirre from none other than Glowburn. But I think just by what he's had to say so far, he easily matches Arlen in this esoteric knowledge about writers from the late 19th century. Way better than me. And I knew Forrest was an author and someone interested in this. So that's one of the reasons I had him on. I haven't talked to him in a long time, and I was very glad to have him on here. So thanks again, Forrest, for being here.
Good to be here.
So when I started reading this story, and I think Forrest actually did a good job of mentioning, he said when we were talking about him being on the show and he'd read The Hollowland, it does feel a little bit like Excalibur, the movie, which has these serious, fantasy battles and ideas and mysticism, but it also gets trippy as all hell sometimes, like a H.P. Lovecraft story when it gets psychedelic on you, or like Clark Ashton Smith or some of those other authors, even from the 20s or whatever, when they start to try and describe these locations or areas that they go to, and they really can't do it very well with just the written word, but they try, and it gets trippy as all get out.
There's also the writer that every person who games claims to have read but never has. That's Lord Dunsany. And Lord Dunsany, he has some trippy stuff. He has some really trippy stuff, and it's difficult to get into. If you thought this was difficult, go read some Lord Dunsany.
I've never heard of that guy, Forrest, but I have heard of Dunsany. It's just me mispronouncing again. I know that.
Get a culture, man.
Arlen probably actually has read this other guy you're talking about. Is that true?
I have read at least 2 or 3 kind of short collections of Dunsany. The Sword of Welleran was one of them, and Time and the Gods, I think. Yeah.
I mean, most people have probably read The King of Elfland's Daughter. That's kind of a standard. But even that is, it's The King of Elfland's Daughter. I mean, it's going to be odd and not normal.
Yeah. Well,
which I think is really cool. When I read this, I was thinking to myself, how would you apply this at the gaming table? I don't know if we'll get into that later, but
I definitely would love to.
Okay. I was thinking about that a lot.
Do you want to just do that now, or should we? Maybe we should dig into the story a little farther. So, I said briefly, this book self-titles this particular story as one of the early romances. So, like Arlen said, you would consider it one of the romantic adventures or romantic stories. But they're considering it early romances because I think it was written even earlier than some of those other later stories that come along. And it really reads kind of like the Similarian or something, where he's basically just talking about himself and how he was who he's related to, and it gets a little more it's all first person, first of all, and I would say for what do they call that when you know everything? First person,
omniscient.
Yeah, omniscient. Yep, that's what I was thinking of. So I don't know if you figured this out yet or not, Forrest, but Arlen and the guests are all the highbrow people, and I'm the lowbrow guy that doesn't even know the right words. But
You're
I'm
doing
like
fine.
relating to like just the common person if they were going to read this, of what they might be able to get out of it for a game or whatever. And the dude, the coolest sounding guy in here, the name, it isn't Florian, it isn't Arnold, it isn't Lady Swanhilda. It's got to be Swanhilda's son, Red Harold. Now, I think we can all get behind a dude named Red Harold. You just picture him with a Arlen beard and hair and a big axe, and I think you got him figured out. But so, like I mentioned in this first, chapter 1 is basically. I love this. Oh man, I don't even know how to really get into this any deeper. Basically, how much they hate this chick for what she did. She came from their village, and they're called the Lilies. What is that historically? Do you guys know what the Lilies are?
You mean beyond just a flower?
Yeah, like their family name. Is this like a real family name or something? Because he talks about what they're wearing and like what their crest is quite a bit. So I didn't know if it was like a real one.
I think it's meant to. I don't think it's meant to be a real family. I think it's meant definitely to connect to some specific symbols. So first off, their symbols are the lily on blue and then a blue cross on white. So the blue cross on white is St. Michael's cross, and the lily on blue I think is meant to suggest the birth of Jesus, and that's a really common that you may remember from the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea. Okay, well,
I don't remember it. I don't doubt you.
Okay, it's a famous song. Anyway,
I've heard of it, the song, but I don't know the words.
Yeah, so it's I think that their symbol being the lilies is meant to, in some ways, attune us to the various symbols that will become much more aggressive by the third part of the story, right? That in the first two parts of the story, we have these kind of symbols that are definitely kind of deeply entwined with both kind of medieval Christianity and Christian mysticism of the Victorian era. And we are meant to kind of pick up on those so that we are paying attention when we get to the third section, where it becomes really symbolic, in my opinion.
Well, two more things about that too is the fleur-de-lis was the symbol for the royal house in France.
Yeah.
And so people would automatically associate that with nobility. And the other thing is, the cynical side of me wants to say it's kind of advertising for William Morris, because if you look at his carvings and his textiles, lilies were all over the place. And like I said, he influenced Art Nouveau really powerfully, and that was one of his main motifs, was the lily.
So how does that compare to this Lady Swanhilda? No, she married the king, but they talk about their colors as well at some point, don't they? Or no? Am I confused?
I believe they do, yes.
They talk about red and gold.
Yeah, red and gold. Or don't they say purple as well or something? Great scarlet cloth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Red Harold. Well, that makes sense. Red Harold. But
yeah.
So, do you guys have anything to add other than what I mentioned so far about chapter 1?
It's interesting because it's not like you have two rival kingdoms. These people are all under the same king, that King Urain or whatever. It's a civil war. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's basically a civil war, or like infighting amongst chieftains. You know?
Yes, that's what I would say, because I'm not sure a civil war actually happens, right? Because
it's more infighting between the different royal houses. But I found it interesting. I mean, they literally killed each other. It wasn't just
Oh no,
political
yeah.
intrigue. They were slitting each other's throats and
Well, yeah. I
stabbing each
mean,
other in the back.
in the night they go to this lady Swanhilda's place. The monks help them, right?
Mm.
Climb over the walls, tell them where to go, give them like monk garb to sneak through in the night because it's snowing. It was my impression. So these monks help them. They all hate this lady Swanhilda, who married the king, right? So she's the queen, right?
Well, and not only is
Oh.
it, I'll just add, not only is it snowing, it's Christmas Eve
Yes.
specifically. It's
Yes,
Christmas
that's right.
the next morning when they're riding away, having killed her.
And she married the king and killed him.
Yes.
Yes, that's
an
right.
important point you don't want to forget.
Yeah, she did. She killed the king as well, which was basically making her son, Red Harold, the prince, right? Because she's still queen, but when she dies, then doesn't he become king? They don't really say that, but that makes some sense, right?
I think it's implied. So there's another king that shows up later, not Red Harold. So I think it's implied that Red Harold is somehow like perhaps in line for the throne, but that King Urain had a brother or a son who actually becomes the next king.
Correct. Yeah.
And she is sort of left as a kind of like a titular queen.
So,
although it's not really, William Morris doesn't seem to be concerned with that element, right? This isn't really a story like Game of Thrones that's focused on like the details of succession or anything.
No, not at all. The first chapter really is them sneaking into this keep with the help of the monks and then getting into this really kind of lurid, macabre scene where they find the queen and then they all kind of like the brother does not want to kill her, but seems like he feels like he has to almost was the impression I got being Alred, right?
Arnold?
Arnold. Yeah. Arnold. Yeah. Is that the feeling you guys got or?
I think he wanted to.
Well, because he almost seemed like he
trying to justify himself, really.
Oh yeah, maybe that's it. He wants to do it, but he's also trying to get other people to help justify why or make it be okay, right?
And that I think that becomes really important later on. There was a line I was looking at. Oh crud, I can't remember where it was, but basically I thought of that meme with the Nazis saying, "So we're the bad guys." It's kind of like there's
that was
a line in there
interesting.
that almost exactly mirrored that. And so I think Arnold is trying to justify killing the queen. He basically gives her a list of crimes. Here are all the things you did, including killing your husband. So I'm gonna lop your head off, or I'm gonna take care of my business. Yeah, but I think he's kind of working himself up too, because he's killing a woman, which is not a knightly thing to do.
This warrant from God, Swanhilda, he said, holding up his sword. Listen, 15 years ago, when I was just winning my spurs, you struck me, disgracing me before all the people. You cursed me and meant that curse well enough. Men of the House of the Lilies, what sentence for that? Death, they said. And so he kind of goes through a few different things. Slew my cousin, your husband. So that must mean that Arnold was cousin to the king at the time. Stabbing him in the throat. What is your sentence? Death, they said.
And later, then he said, "Men of the House of the Lilies, do you justify me in this? Shall she die?" And so he's looking for backup, basically.
Although he also, Arnold specifically says that he's the one who's going to kill her and he's not going to do it with help because he only wants that sin on his soul, essentially. True. Which I think is it's kind of an interesting contradiction to need the justification from the men, but also be trying to protect them from, or perhaps particularly only allow as a way to try to limit the possibility of like blood feud or something like that, to say that, well, this is between me and her, not between all of us and her family and all of that.
I like it because it lends some complexity to the character.
Yeah.
He's not a paladin or an assassin. He's both.
Which, that isn't necessarily the romantic version of the knight isn't realistic, but I guess in stories they did kind of, no, isn't that the thing? They were always big, just like we talked about previously, Arlen and I on Hobbs and Friends, when we mentioned that when you're playing Pendragon, a game like that, they're big. Their evil is great, and their heroism is great. They do everything's big. They don't do anything small, really. So he's like you say, he's a big woman killer, a queen killer, but he also is a man of God, or he believes himself, right, to be a man of God.
Well, doesn't this? Okay, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but doesn't this hit at the whole crux of the idea of alignment?
Maybe.
I'll be honest, I hate alignment. I think it's just one of the dumbest things in the world, but I'm sure other people will hate me for saying that. That's cool. You do your lawful good thing. But
Damn it.
Lost Earl again.
All right. I am going to be doing some research into how to prevent that from happening while you guys talk for just a second.
All right, so
like evil.
So basically at this point, after they kill Queen Swanhilda, that is when Red Harold and his men show up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're basically, Red Harold shows up, and all over, because all his arms he wore a great scarlet cloth that fell in heavy folds about his horse and all about him. Do you feel like in some way this is like an iconic thing trying to tell us about Red Harold, or what?
I think there's a couple. I think there's this is an interesting twist, because in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, the Revelation of St. John, Christ comes back to the earth dressed in red, because he's been basically doused in the blood of sinners. But he's coming back with vengeance and judgment at this time. He's basically unleashing judgment on the earth. So I find it interesting that he would be dressed completely in scarlet like that. The Red Harold would be dressed like that, because it's like, again, it's ambiguous. Is Harold like a Christ figure, justifiably coming in and wreaking havoc and causing destruction, or is he red, as we sometimes think of it as like the color of evil, the color of death?
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's complicated, and I like that about this piece, that characters are not so cut and dried.
So, but if that's the case, isn't it interesting that when he's chased off, there's an exact line in here that as he clenched his fist at our house, as he did so, the east wind coming down the street caught up the corner of that scarlet cloth and drove it over his face, and therewithal disordering his long black hair, well nigh choked him, so that he bit both his hair and that cloth. So it's kind of like he is this cloth and this person, but it also hinders him because of it, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
It's really interesting symbolism. It's almost like, if you do view him as a Christ figure, is he blaspheming? I mean, there's all kinds of levels you can take to this.
And that it probably leads to my favorite part of the story, is this concept of St. Mary's Church and the bell ringing, and how they call it Mary Rings.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty. What's the symbolism of Mary ringing? Not to talk about further in the story, but just this idea of the thunder of Mary was caught up by the wind and carried all through the country. And when the good man heard it, he said goodbye to wife and child, and slung his shield behind his back, and set forward with his spear sloped over his shoulder. And many a time as he walked toward the good town, he tightened the belt that went about his waist, that he might stride the faster. So long and furiously did Mary toll. So that's kind of almost how they called the levies in or something. And it was, some sort of arming call for them or something.
Mm-hmm. It's a rallying cry.
Yeah.
Well, and it becomes their particular war cry too, right? Mary Rings being similar to like Montjoy, or to go back to Excalibur, right? One land, one king is their thing. That this idea that they have 13 bells, 12 for the apostles and 1 for Mary in their church is, I think, really interesting. And it's I'm not entirely sure what it is. I don't know that there's a particular reference in Mary Rings just the phrase outside of this text, although it's certainly possible. I didn't look it up.
No, I haven't heard either. You know anything,
No.
Forrest?
No.
All right.
It's also interesting to me, though, that both sides in this conflict are, of course, using their religious vows to justify where they are in the fight.
But that's pretty common, though, in that era, right?
It is. It is, but it kind of gives the lie to this whole idea of Christianity unifying. When you look at medieval Christianity in particular, before the Reformation and the Renaissance, you think of it as one lump. And yet there are people both. I mean, you see this all over, throughout history, people fighting in the name of God. But again, I find that intriguing and again, complex. I like that.
My first experience with that, I think, was the Cornwall Viking books, the stories that they changed into that Netflix show, The Last Kingdom. Yeah, where every time they were always talking about God is with us, God is with us. They're all saying it back and forth to each other, and it was like, I don't know if God can be with both of you. God just wants you guys all to die. I'm confused, but.
In the film The Kingdom of Heaven, they do a really good job of something similar, that both the Christian and the Muslim sides say. Obviously, it's for the Christian side it would be Deus Vult, and for the Muslim side Inshallah, but it's translated into English as God wills it for both sides, and they say it all the time, fighting each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, at the end, the king actually shows up, the white-haired king, and this we also get to meet Squire Hugh, who is maybe my favorite character in the whole story. The king basically shows up, and this is where I start to get lost. I'm not even sure what he's saying. Basically, will you settle this quarrel by the judgment of God? And I guess Arnold says, yeah, if you can take me, if you can do it, then you can do it. But the House of Lily is like F you or something. I don't know. What did you guys think about that?
pretty much it, yeah.
And the cool thing is, I mean, they're only like a days away from each other. They're not that far from each other. Because it's talked about how Red Harold was like, that very night he wanted to take his vengeance and figure out what he was going to do and talk to the king, and then rode off to talk, to take care of it. So you were right about that whole, like the king's brother or something.
So then Arnold said to those about him, lift me up. So they laid a great shield on 2 lances, and these 4 men carried, and thereon stood Arnold and gazed about him. So standing on top of a shield carried by men is a very ancient symbol of kingship in a lot of cultures. Roman emperors sometimes would be carried on shields by legionaries, and especially in the various Germanic barbarian cultures, a lot of them use this as a symbol that the king stands on top of a shield carried by his men. And so there's a sort of, I'm sure that William Morris was aware of this, or I suspect that he was, and that we are meant to understand that Arnold is presenting a threat to the king's authority as a potential another king, right? Because they're the cousins of the line of kings, apparently. And Arnold has taken it upon himself to avenge King Urain, the last king. That I think that is meant to understand that this current king, who we never get the name of, he is partly interested not just in kind of restoring justice or doing right by Red Harold, but in ensuring that the family of the Lillys does not become the kings, that he's sort of ambitious and concerned about their own ambition.
Not only that, but that practice of, the Gauls and the Goths in particular were big on carrying their kings on shields. That is a pagan tradition. That is a pre-Christian tradition, and it did not happen after Christianity came into view. So you've got this king who's justified by Christianity being anointed by God, so to speak, and then you've got Arnold, who is basically committing this pagan act, kind of flying in defiance of this godly authority. So there's some interesting conflict going on there too.
Yeah. I think you're right. He basically is saying, you're not my king anymore, and we're just going to head up to the hills, and there's not a man over there that can stop us. And they
Yeah,
didn't.
that's pretty much what he says
Yeah,
to the
and we
king
went.
and to Red Harold.
He's become a murder hobo by this point.
With a whole bunch of men behind him, though. I mean, he's a
Right.
9th level murder hobo at this point because he's got his own kingdom. So, so failing. All right. So, is there anything in this first chapter that we would relate to gaming?
Again, the whole thing about alignment I find just fascinating, and yeah, it's more complex than straight up lawful good. Sorry, Gygax, but people are more complex than that, and I like the fact that they highlight that.
One of the ways that I have played lawful good in the past isn't like a goody two shoes person. It's more like, okay, I'm lawful and I'm good. I think like you could do lawful good being that righteous priest from the old Disney cartoon of Quasimodo, where you believe you are doing good and you believe you're lawful in the sense that you're trying to uphold civilization and move towards following the rules and creating an environment and a life or community that are rules users as opposed to chaos, which is usually considered against law, right? But it doesn't necessarily be good in our eyes. Like, I mean, there were lawful good dudes who would take slaves or something, which obviously in this day and age is something would never agree to or think was right, but they would take them and then sell them to the church or get that money for the church. But I guess historic people are flawed. You're never going to be this lawful good person. Even like Sturm was not perfect in the Dragonlance. He still had some issues, and I think most people would say he was lawful good. But I agree. I think you're right. I don't know if I like alignment that well, but I don't know if Pendragon's way is the way to go either, Arlen.
I think Pendragon is the way to go.
Oh my God.
I think part of the issue is people conflate lawfulness with goodness.
Oh yeah.
So the thing is, you look, oh gosh, I don't know if I want to use a name. Stalin was technically lawful, right? Mm-hmm. Technically, he imposed a law, and he imposed the law, but he was not good.
No, exactly, yeah.
So there's a fundamental difference there. I think that people tend to conflate, and that's I kind of like the old basic D&D where it's lawful, neutral, and chaotic, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's more of a tendency to how you act in relation to society rather than a moral good or a moral evil.
All right. Well, let's take that and apply that to this first chapter then. Is Arnold, is he chaotic? Because he's obviously breaking the law. He's revolting against his king.
I think neutral because he's
self-centered. And
he's trying to justify himself. He's trying to obey this law, but he's obviously can't help himself. he just can't help but stab that lady, and he's letting his anger get the best of him. I don't know. I view him as kind of neutral, on balance.
Arlen, you got anything to add?
I agree. I would call him neutral out of lawful and chaotic and neutral. I think there's an interesting way in which kind of there's a sort of, to go back to the kingship thing, there's a sort of theoretical element to this idea that almost the king is above the law that Arnold, I think, also takes into himself, right? This idea that, if the king is, say, appointed by God or something like that, then the mortal laws of the world don't have any bearing on the king. And I think that's I think Arnold himself would say that that's kind of exactly what has happened with him, is that the kind of divine ordinance is what justifies him, and as well as his men and all of that sort of stuff, and that therefore he doesn't need to be lawful or neutral or chaotic. He's just
is.
He's just his kind of particular, not even self-centered, but self-driven almost.
But somebody on the outside would look at him and say he's chaotic.
Yeah,
because he's upsetting the order. So it's again,
there's a lot of interpretations for sure.
Or people are complex, and to impose that. I don't know if you want to play a character that way. Great, fantastic. I've had fun playing characters that were probably considered lawful good, but I don't know. People are just way more complex than that.
Yeah.
Then again, it's a game, so
Well,
it doesn't have to be like.
Although to put it, since we mentioned Pendragon, in Pendragon terms, Arnold could have like a 16 or higher just and a 16 or higher vengeful, and be a character who is definitely concerned with justice being done around himself, but also doesn't let a grudge go ever, right? And that, I think, actually would work pretty well at mechanically modeling this particular character.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we could talk about alignment forever, and this is a library show, so let's move away from that. We're only on chapter 2, and we've been talking for 40 minutes. So
let's fail in the world.
And I'm supposed to be playing a game in 20 minutes, so that's our hard stop usually. But if it goes a little longer, it goes a little longer. So in chapter 2, this is where the line is, where I think you were talking about, Forrest, where they've stolen, or they're not stolen, but they're driving cattle through Red Harold's land, and they see, they get cut off by Harold's men in this row of hills, or this light valley, and he says, "I felt a dull weight on my heart. Had our house been the devil's servants all along? I thought we were God's servants."
That's the one, yes.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool, that's a interesting, as a person starts to self-analyze in a story and maybe put to words what the reader has wondered or considered all along, right? So I guess somebody else want to take over, because I kind of feel like I dominated chapter 1, and the rest of this stuff is where it starts to get crazy. So what happens after that, Forrest?
A lot of it's the fog of war, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of back and forth, and it's kind of you really have to slow down your reading if you're going to parse out who's attacking who and which way. But eventually, is it in this chapter when Arnold falls? I believe.
Well, he said it had been a strange battle. We had never fought better, and yet through it all, it had ended in a retreat.
Right. Yeah, yep. and that's the thing. There's kind of a surreal quality to the whole thing. It's actually kind of more than just the fog of war. Almost like a supernatural shift is taking place, and the men noticed it too, if I recall correctly.
I kind of wondered if they were fighting each other at some point. Their own men were fighting each other.
Yeah.
And it seemed like they didn't know what they were going to do, and they were flipping the F out, and then they could hear Mary ringing, right? Or did someone just say that it was ringing, and so then they gathered themselves?
We shouted all together, "Merry rings," then laid our bridles on the necks of our horses, spurred forward, and in 5 minutes they were all slain, and I was down among the horses.
That's when I was wondering if they had killed their own people there, or what had kind of happened, because it just seemed weird the way that it was written.
Yeah, that's the way that I read it, was that there was so much confusion that they ended up killing themselves, or killing their fellow fighters.
Is that what you thought too, Arlen?
I think there are definitely moments when they seem to attack each other. There was one, I can't find it right now, but there's one sequence where Florian describes seeing a man in essentially the right coat of arms that he attacks. Mm-hmm. And
Yep, I do recall that too.
Yeah. Then, as they came on, I noted hurriedly that the first man was one of Arnold's men, and one of our men behind him leaned forward to prod him with his spear, but could not reach so far, till he himself was run through the eye with a spear, and throwing up his arms fell dead with a shriek. Also, I noticed that concerning this first man, that the laces of his helmet were loose, and when he saw me, he lifted up his left hand to his head, took off his helmet, and cast it at me, and still tore on. The helmet flew over my head, and I, sitting there, swung out, hitting him in the neck. His head flew right off, for the mail held no more than a piece of silk, which suggests to me that Florian and other of his men are killing their own men.
Oh,
right?
When I read that silk part, I thought maybe that it was like now they're fighting golems or illusory people that look like themselves. I didn't know.
No, I think it means that Florian has a really strong swing and a sharp sword and chops through the mail.
Because he even says that, I do not know if I have been fighting men or only simulacra.
Yes, there's a lot about, as it starts to get strange, people worrying about kind of what is actually going on here before we get really strange in chapter 3, right? Because there's another great quote, and my heart sunk within me. There was no reason why this should not be true. There was no reason why anything should not be true. And I think that's basically what happens, is that suddenly we're in a world where there's this sort of overabundance of truth, right? Because that's sort of what deeply symbolist literature and art is kind of about, is this idea of an overabundance of truth or reality, that you can't approach it in the normal way of approaching reality because it's just too much. It's, you can only approach it through these symbols that are sort of almost like using sunglasses to look at the sun.
Well, going back to Arthur Machen, I think of his story, The White People, and he's talking about sin in particular and evil. And basically, in essence, evil was being exposed to everything that nature is without any filters. Like you see everything for what it really is. And that can turn you, and that's horror. That's pure horror. And I think it's a similar thought here.
Or even Burkean Sublime, Edmund Burke in his On the Sublime talks about the idea that we might feel horror at the experience of something kind of so pure and good, despite that seeming like something that we should feel despite that being something that it seems like should feel a connection to if we want to be pure and good, but that something like that would be so sublime that it is actually terrifying to experience.
It's so overwhelmingly beautiful. I think of Joseph Campbell. What was his book? It's about mythology. Anyway, he was talking about one of the astronauts, the first astronauts that went into space and looked down on the Earth. He was trying to describe the sublime. And he said that the astronaut went on a spacewalk and he looked down on the Earth, and it was simultaneously the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and filled him with complete terror that he was floating out in outer space, attached by a 4-inch diameter cord to a spaceship, moving at 50,000 miles an hour. And it all hit him at once. And he said it was the most beautiful, terrifying thing at the same time. And that's kind of the feeling that I get.
That even happens in here with Margaret, right? Florian, upon seeing Margaret, feels he can tell that she's beautiful, and he immediately loves her with all his heart and knows that she's his true love and all that sort of stuff. But he's also terrified of her and kind of spiteful when he interacts with her.
He doesn't want him to touch her.
Yeah.
So you jumped ahead. We should talk about, so when you mentioned that they were all slain, I think that's all of the Lily's men were slain, and even Florian, our protagonist, was down among the horses, and now basically Red Herald comes up, attempts to kill him, and then Florian falls through the earth into the Hollow Land, right?
Yeah,
basically.
One interesting thing I find there, if you want to dive into gaming for a second, is in the way that D&D was laid out with the planes, there are like distinct barriers. Like you had to go through a portal to get to another plane, or you had to magically get through.
Or travel through the astral or something.
Yeah, to either get through a wall or another area. But here, it's like it's kind of bleeding into reality where they're not totally immersed in it at first, but they're in this borderland, this hazy borderland between the Hollow Land and our reality. And
it was known for that, right? This area was actually kind of known for that, even being a thinness to the veil here.
Right. And I think that's a really cool thing you could do with gaming, is you might not go completely into another plane, but what if you're in a place that's bordering it, that's close, and things aren't quite completely like the other plane, but it does, adversely affect the area that you're in, gives it kind of an alien feel. That you could play with that a lot, I think.
Yeah, I think that sounds kind of like the whole Shadow Realm versus the Elfland in different cosmologies of even official D&D, where like in the Shadowland it's the same but different, and sometimes you have these thinness, these areas of interaction that things. I think that's pretty common. Maybe it came from this. I don't even know, but that's even common with a lot of books. Like if you're traveling between in urban fantasy, like I can't even think of something off the top of my head, but urban fantasy does that too. Like the Man and the Frost, is that what it's called? When they kind of pass back and forth, or Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or there's quite a few different stories since this is one of the earliest ones. This is like almost the father of fantasy we're talking about in some ways, right?
Well, and in medieval literature, that's a really common thing, is that you might be out hunting and ride into a part of the forest that you've never been, and suddenly the person that you meet in the forest is not a person, but the king of the other world or something like that, right? That's something that happens in the first branch of the Mabinogion, is that the hero is out hunting with his dogs and meets the king of the other world, who needs him to sub in for him to deal with some problems going on and go further into the other world, right?
I can't make an heir. Help me out, buddy. No.
Worse yet, you run into the daughter of the king of the other world, and then things go really sideways.
Yeah, the Frost Giant's daughter. No. All right. A little Fofford for you. All right. So he calls it Chapter 3. What is this FYTTE? Fight the First? Is this like this chapter that you're like a chapter within a chapter you're talking about?
Yeah. I think it is a term from epic poetry or skaldic poetry. But there are 3 of these sections, 3 fights. And that seems, I mean, it seems to me it's very easy to connect that to the idea of the Trinity, and that the way he goes through all of these different symbolically important things that happen to him. Florian.
3 chapter, 3 fights.
3 chapters, 3 fights.
It kind of reflects Dante Alighieri and the the Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Okay, so
well,
go ahead.
And Dante's, of course, version has this kind of wonderful fractal quality because of the terza rima. Because terza rima is built on the 3-line structure too, so it's 3 lines divided into cantos and then divided up into the 3 books. Yeah. And so it's there's something I think similar going on here.
So what basically happens is, like, he's in the Hollowland, he meets this person, but she kind of, we don't really understand who she is, but he seems to know her but doesn't know her. And then they seem to have a life together, right? And that's fight 1. And then in fight 2, he somehow is back somewhere else in the water and runs into a person that he knows but doesn't know, and realize that neither of them remember anything, but he ends up being Red Herald, and he kills him but doesn't quite kill him. And so then he teaches him how to paint.
And he doesn't even know his own name.
Right. He doesn't know who he is, but neither does Harold, right?
Right. And that's part of the glamour, if you will, of the other world, is that they don't remember who they are. It's not that they don't know. Remember.
They're both in the Hollowland?
Well, it's unclear, I think, at that point whether they are in the Hollowland, because he comes back to a castle that he recognizes as his
his father's castle. Yeah,
and at the very beginning, he told us that he wasn't in the Hollowland. So I think there is a possibility assumed that he's had this life with Margaret in the Hollowland, and then is back in this sort of liminal space in between the Hollowland and the world, for lack of a better term, with Red Herald, that Herald has perhaps never actually left. And then he once again is in the Hollowland again for Fight the Third, the last little bit.
I find it interesting, though, that when he goes to the castle the second time, it's the sense of time is completely warped.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a Rip Van Winkle. It's like, how long was he in Hollowland? It could have been, decades.
Because he's now past, he's past the prime of life. His hair and beard scattered with white. Body was growing weaker. My memory of all things was very faint. But see, he's wearing purple, scarlet, and blue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. Why is he wearing scarlet and purple now?
Brought the houses together.
Oh,
Or his rules somehow. That's a possibility. I don't know.
and there's this whole thing where he's like tearing this thing off of his head, and it ends up being a worm, and it's like he's escaped. That I took this to mean that he's escaped the Hollow Land, and that he's like been laying there underneath some fey curse or ensorcelled, or like you said, a glamour somehow, and just living in his head until he rips this thing off. But then he runs into Red Herald, who stabs him to get him out of the water.
Yeah, stabs him with a fishing spear.
Yeah, I see him gleefully coming over and then helps him out.
Well, particularly, right, the connection, again, saved, it's sort of almost a martyrology, right? This idea that he's harmed by the fishing spear. And, of course, we know that Jesus is the fish because of ichthus and all that sort of stuff, and that he is saved and returned to the world through that. Right. It seems like it's something that belongs out of like a medieval saint's life or something.
So I have a question for you guys. When this story was written, do you think that many of the readers would have a greater grasp of all these allusions and the iconography that because I have no idea. I didn't know any of this stuff. So when I'm reading it, I'm not grabbing the, Icarus or any of that, the fish stuff. I'm not grabbing any of that symbology. So do you think at the time this was written that the common reader would have those things and really get these allegories that you're talking about compared to me not getting them?
It's an interesting question because even back in the 1800s, not nearly as many people could read as do now. But they, in order to have some religious indoctrination, rather than reading, they'd put up stained glass windows. And they would have the stories of the scriptures in the stained glass windows. And of course, they'd hear them in sermons as well. So, I mean, they would be indoctrinated into it. Yes, they would know those symbols, but would they read them?
A magazine, right?
No. Yeah. I mean, who could afford a magazine then? Really, it's not like now where it's common and cheap.
Yeah. And worth remembering that Morris was a student at Oxford, right, which is pretty much the most prestigious university in the whole world, and he wrote it for the magazine that was published there, right? I don't know how much he expected and he wrote it when he was 22, right? Mm-hmm. So who knows how much he expected this to be a kind of larger common phenomenon. He may have been, as much as anything, just writing for his friends who would read the Oxford magazine, basically, and who would definitely they probably would have known a lot of these different symbols and signs and the different kind of history that he's referencing and all that sort of stuff, because they were, taught in that same sphere as he was, where he probably learned a lot of it.
Well, even beyond that, Christian mysticism was a big deal right then. The Rosicrucians were getting strong. The Knights Templar were starting to rumored to be coming back. This later led to
1890s.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Yeah, in the 1870s, the 1890s. Later on, that led to Aleister Crowley and others, down the line. So
this was 1856 that this was done.
But they were in not just a Christian tradition, but in a Christian mystical tradition, which is a little bit different and really more. It was mostly educated and wealthy people who were part of that. Who were, because let's face it, some of them were just boys' clubs, or gentlemen's clubs, and in the guise of Christianity and mysticism. So. It really is kind of an in crowd here, but most people would understand most of the symbols, I would think. The ones that are straight up Christian, some of the Rosicrucian symbols and stuff like that, you probably have to have some special training in that and be indoctrinated because it's more esoteric type stuff.
So this chapter 2